He was just a small boy, the kind most people would walk past without noticing. Short, thin, with slightly messy hair, and clothes that were always clean, but clearly worn many times. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was low and careful, as if he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. In school, teachers often described him as quiet but polite. Other kids saw him as someone who stayed in the background. He wasn't the fastest runner, not the loudest speaker, and not the one raising his hand every minute. Most days, he blended into the room like he was meant to stay unseen. At home, life was simple. There were no fancy things, no big house, and no extra money for hobbies or toys. His family worked hard just to get through each month. Evenings were usually quiet. After dinner, the television stayed off to save electricity, and everyone found something small to do before bed. That silence, which might have felt empty to others, felt safe to him. It gave him space to think, to listen, and to feel. The piano entered his life almost by accident. One afternoon, after school, he followed his mother to a community building nearby. She had to help clean a room there for a few hours. The boy sat on a chair in the corner, swinging his legs back and forth, bored and restless. In the next room, the door was slightly open. Inside, there was an old upright piano. The wood was scratched, some keys were yellowed, and it looked like it hadn't been played in a long time at first. He just stared at it from a distance. Something about it pulled him in. Maybe it was the way the light from the window fell across the keys. Or maybe it was the quiet promise that the instrument seemed to hold. When no one was watching, he slowly walked over. He lifted the piano bench with effort and climbed onto it. His feet didn't even reach the floor. He pressed one key. The sound surprised him. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm. It filled the room in a way that felt alive. He pressed another key, then another. Soon, he was tapping out small sounds, not following any song, just listening. He smiled without realizing it. From that day on, whenever he could, he found his way back to that piano. No one taught him at first. He didn't know about notes or scales. He didn't even know what the keys were called. He just listened. He watched videos when he could borrow a phone. He remembered sounds from music he heard on the radio. Slowly, his fingers began to move with purpose. He learned which sounds felt happy, which felt sad, and which made his chest feel tight in a way he couldn't explain. The piano became his safe place. When school felt overwhelming, when other kids ignored him or laughed quietly at his old shoes, he thought about the keys. When things felt too loud inside his head, he imagined melodies. Music became the way he spoke without words. It was the only place where he didn't feel small. At home, there was no piano. He practiced in his mind instead. He would tap rhythms on the table, on his legs, even on the wall. Sometimes, late at night, he moved his fingers in the air, silently playing songs only he could hear. His family noticed but didn't fully understand. They thought it was just a phase, something he would grow out of. But he didn't. Over time, people at the community building started noticing that the piano sounded different when he was around. The music wasn't random anymore. It flowed. It told stories. Some stopped to listen from the hallway. Others sat quietly in the back of the room, surprised that such sound could come from such small hands. Still, no one called him special. No one labeled him a prodigy. To the world, he was still just a quiet boy playing an old piano, and he was okay with that. He never played to impress. When people clapped, he looked down, unsure of what to do. When someone asked where he learned, he shrugged and said, "I just listen." He didn't know the words to explain what music meant to him. He only knew that without it, something inside him felt missing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the windows orange, he sat at the piano again. The building was quieter than usual. His fingers touched the keys, and he began to play something new. It wasn't a song he had heard before. It came from somewhere deep inside him. The notes rose and fell like emotions he had never spoken out loud. Unbeknownst to him, someone stood just outside the door. That person paused. Listening closely, the boy kept playing. Unaware that this moment, this simple evening in a nearly empty room, was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The person standing outside the door did not move right away. They were someone who had spent most of their life around music. Concert halls, practice rooms, competitions, students, rehearsals, all of it was familiar. They had heard thousands of performances. From beginners struggling with basic notes to advanced players showing perfect technique, very little surprised them anymore. Most music followed patterns they could predict within seconds. But what they were hearing now made them stop. The sound coming from the room was not loud or dramatic. It was calm, almost gentle. Yet there was something unusual about it. The notes were placed carefully, as if the person playing was thinking deeply about every sound. There were small pauses, slight changes in rhythm, moments where the music seemed to breathe. It didn't sound like a child copying something they had heard. It sounded like someone speaking honestly, without trying to impress. The professional leaned slightly closer to the door. They expected to see a grown student, or perhaps an adult practicing after hours. Instead, when they finally looked inside, they saw the small boy sitting at the piano. His legs still didn't reach the floor. His back was straight, but not stiff. His face was serious, focused, almost peaceful. His fingers moved smoothly over the keys, not rushing, not hesitating. For a moment, the professional thought they must be mistaken. Children that young usually played with stiffness or excitement. They missed notes. They showed effort on their faces. But this boy looked different. He wasn't fighting the piano. He seemed to understand it. The professional stayed silent. They didn't want to interrupt. They stood there listening, letting the boy finish. The music slowly came to an end. The boy lifted his hands and rested them in his lap. He exhaled softly, like someone waking from a dream. Only then did he notice someone else in the room. He froze. His eyes widened slightly, and his shoulders tensed. He quickly stood up from the bench, unsure if he was in trouble. Adults usually didn't like kids touching things without permission, especially instruments. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, looking down. "I'll stop." The professional raised a hand gently. "No," they said. "You don't need to stop." Their voice was calm, not strict. Still, the boy stayed tense. "How long have you been playing?" the professional asked. The boy thought for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Sometimes. When I can," that answer surprised them. "Who teaches you?" the professional asked next. The boy shook his head. "No one." The professional stepped closer to the piano. They looked at the keys, then at the boy's hands. Small hands. No signs of formal training. No calluses from long forced practice. Yet the control was there. "What were you playing just now?" they asked. The boy shrugged again. "I don't know, I just played." That was not the answer they expected, but somehow it made sense. The professional asked him to sit again. The boy hesitated, then slowly climbed back onto the bench. "Can you play that again?" they asked. The boy nodded. His fingers returned to the keys. This time, he was a little nervous. The music wasn't exactly the same. It never was. But it carried the same feeling. Soft, thoughtful, honest. As he played, the professional noticed details that made their heart beat faster. The way the boy changed tempo without losing balance. The way he used silence, letting notes fade before moving on. These were things even trained students struggled with. When the boy finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. "That was very good," the professional said slowly. The boy didn't smile. He just nodded, as if he wasn't sure what good really meant. "Do you know how special this is?" the professional asked. The boy looked confused. "It's just piano," he said. That answer stayed with them. They sat down beside him and asked gentle questions. Where he learned to listen, how he remembered songs, how often he played. The boy answered simply, without exaggeration. He talked about tapping rhythms on tables, about playing in his head at night, about how the piano made him feel calm. There was no pride in his voice, no need to show off. Music wasn't something he used to stand out. It was something he used to survive. The professional realized something important in that moment. This boy wasn't chasing applause. He wasn't copying others. He was listening to something inside himself, Before leaving, the professional asked if they could come back another day to listen again. The boy nodded shyly. That night, the professional couldn't stop thinking about him. They had met many talented students before, but talent alone was common. What was rare was sincerity. This boy played without fear, without performance pressure, without ego. That kind of connection to music couldn't be taught easily. Over the next few days, the professional returned. Sometimes the boy was there. Sometimes he wasn't. When he was, they listened quietly, never interrupting. Each time, the music sounded a little different, but the feeling stayed strong. Soon, other people began to notice too. A cleaner paused her work to listen. A staff member leaned against the wall. A few visitors sat quietly nearby. No one spoke. The boy didn't even realize he had an audience. When someone finally clapped one afternoon, the boy stopped playing immediately, startled. His face turned red. He looked around, unsure. "It's okay," the professional said gently. "They're clapping because they liked it." The boy nodded but kept his eyes on the floor. The professional began to understand that this talent came with vulnerability. The boy didn't know how to receive praise. He didn't know how to explain what he did. He only knew how to feel. One day the professional brought sheet music and placed it on the piano. "Can you try this?" they asked. The boy stared at the page. Notes, lines, symbols. It was unfamiliar territory. "I can try," he said. Slowly, carefully, he began. He made mistakes at first, then adjusted. He listened more than he read. By the end, he wasn't perfect, but he understood the heart of the piece. The professional smiled too. Themselves, this was just the beginning. They knew that soon. The world around this quiet boy would start to change. Opportunities would appear. Expectations would grow, and challenges would come with them. But for now, he was still just a child sitting at an old piano playing from the heart, unaware that his music had already left a lasting mark on someone who thought they had heard it all. The day everything truly changed started like any other day for the boy. He arrived at the community building quietly, carrying his school bag on one shoulder. His shoes were a little worn, and his jacket sleeves were slightly too short, but he didn't seem to care. He nodded politely to the people he passed and made his way toward the familiar room with the old piano. He didn't know that more people than usual were already inside the building. The professional had returned again. But this time, they weren't alone. They hadn't planned anything big. They simply wanted a second opinion, someone else who understood music deeply. So they invited another experienced musician to listen, someone who had spent years teaching and performing. Neither of them told the boy. They didn't want him to feel nervous or pressured. When the boy entered the room, he noticed a few chairs arranged differently than usual. A couple of unfamiliar adults sat quietly, pretending to look at their phones or papers. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should play. "It's okay," the professional said softly. "You can play like you always do," was all the boy needed. He climbed onto the bench, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. At first, the notes came slowly. He always needed a moment to settle his thoughts. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. Then the music began to grow. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. But it carried something heavy and honest. The melody rose gently, then dipped into something sadder. His fingers moved with confidence. Not because he had practiced this piece many times, but because he trusted his instincts. The professional exchanged a brief glance with the other musician. They were both listening closely now. As the boy continued, the music shifted. There were unexpected turns, moments where he changed rhythm without losing control. It felt like listening to a story without words. You didn't need to understand music to feel it. You just needed to listen. A few people passing by outside the room slowed their steps. One person stopped completely. Another quietly sat down near the back. The sound had pulled them in without effort. The boy didn't notice any of this. His eyes were focused on the keys. His face showed calm, but inside, he was somewhere else. He was thinking about long evenings at home, about feeling invisible at school, about the way music made those feelings easier to carry. Every note held something personal, something real. The professionals noticed something that made their breathing slow. The boy wasn't just playing notes. He was shaping silence. He knew when not to play. He allowed moments to rest, letting emotion settle before moving on. That kind of control usually came from years of training and experience. Yet here it was, coming naturally from a child who didn't even know the names of the notes. As the final sound faded, no one clapped right away, not because they didn't like it, because they didn't want to break the moment. The boy slowly lifted his hands and rested them in his lap. He sat still, waiting. When he finally looked up, he noticed the small group of people watching him. His heart skipped. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked quietly. "No," the professional said quickly. "Not at all." The other musicians stood up. Their face showed something between surprise and disbelief. "How old are you?" they asked gently. The boy answered honestly. The musicians shook their heads slowly. "And no lessons?" they asked. The boy shook his head too. They let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not from humor. From amazement, they sat down at the piano and played a short, complex piece. Their fingers moved quickly and cleanly. It was impressive, polished, and confident. When they finished, they turned to the boy. "Can you try something like that?" they asked, not challenging him, just curious. The boy nodded. He placed his hands on the keys again. He didn't copy exactly what he heard. Instead, he took parts of it and made them his own. He slowed some sections, changed others, and added something new. It wasn't perfect, but it was expressive. The room felt different now. The professionals realized they weren't just witnessing talent. They were witnessing instinct, something raw and rare. One of them quietly whispered, "This shouldn't be possible." The boy didn't hear that. He was too busy wondering if he had played well enough. Praise still made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to adults looking at him like this, like he mattered. After the session, the professionals spoke privately. They talked about potential, about responsibility, about how fragile this kind of gift could be if handled the wrong way. They agreed on one thing. This boy needed guidance, not pressure. When they returned to him, their tone was gentle. "We'd like to help you," one of them said. "Only if you want." The boy looked confused. "Help me how?" "Teach you things," they said. "Not to change how you play. Just to give you tools." The boy thought for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. That small nod felt heavier than any contract. Over the next few days, word spread quietly. Not on the internet. Not in headlines. Just through whispers and conversations. People came by more often. Some stayed to listen. Some wiped tears without knowing why. The boy noticed the change. He felt eyes on him more often. At first, it made him nervous. His fingers shook. He made mistakes. Once he stopped in the middle of a song and apologized. The professional knelt beside him. "You don't owe anyone perfection," they said. "Just honesty." That helped. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. A man who had been listening quietly approached the piano after the boy finished. He didn't say much. He simply said, "I lost someone recently. That music helped me breathe again." The boy didn't know how to respond. He just nodded. But that night he thought about those words again and again. For the first time, he realized that his music wasn't just helping him. It was helping others too. That realization changed how he played. Not in style, but in purpose. He began to play with even more care. Not to impress, but to connect. He listened more deeply. He trusted silence more. Each session felt heavier, but also more meaningful. The professionals watched quietly, sometimes worried, sometimes amazed. They knew moments like this could shape a person for life. One evening, after everyone left, the boy stayed behind at the piano. The room was empty. The lights were dim. He placed his fingers on the keys and played softly, just for himself. He didn't know where this path would lead. He didn't know about stages, awards, or futures. He only knew that music was no longer just his safe place. It was becoming his voice. And somewhere deep inside, even though he couldn't name it yet, he felt that the world had begun to listen. After that realization, things slowly began to change around the boy. Even though his daily life still looked the same on the surface, he still went to school, still sat quietly in class, still walked home with his bag hanging low on his shoulder. Most people who saw him on the street would never guess that something special was growing inside him. But inside the community building, the atmosphere around him was different now. When he sat at the piano, people paid attention. The professionals who had been watching him became more involved, but they were careful. They understood that pushing too hard could take away the very thing that made his playing special. So instead of forcing strict lessons, they listened first. They let him play the way he always had. Only after that did they gently suggest small ideas. A different way to place his fingers. A softer touch here. A pause there. The boy listened closely. He didn't argue or pretend to know more than he did. When something felt right, he used it. When it didn't, he let it go. The professionals noticed this and respected it. They realized they weren't shaping him. They were walking beside him. One afternoon, the professional asked him a simple question. "What do you feel when you play?" The boy sat quietly for a long time before answering. He stared at the keys, then said, "It feels like I'm not alone." That answer stayed in the room. The professional nodded slowly. They understood now that music was not a hobby for this boy. It was a place where he felt seen, even when no one was watching. As weeks passed, more people came to listen. Not crowds, not cameras, just ordinary people. Some were tired after work. Some were dealing with stress. Some simply wandered in and stayed because the sound made them pause. The boy didn't know their stories, but he felt their presence. He learned how energy in the room changed his playing. When someone was tense, his music softened. When the room felt heavy, he slowed down. He was learning empathy without realizing it. At first, the attention scared him. His hands sometimes trembled. He made mistakes and felt embarrassed. Once, he stopped playing halfway through a piece and whispered, "I'm sorry." The room went quiet. The professional walked over and knelt beside him. "You don't need to say sorry," they said gently. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being real." The boy nodded, blinking back tears. Then he placed his hands back on the keys and continued. Not perfectly, but honestly. The people listening felt it. Some smiled. Some closed their eyes. That day marked a shift. The professional decided it was time to say something clearly, something they had been holding back. After the boy finished playing, they spoke so everyone could hear. "I've been around music my whole life," they said. "And what this child has is rare. Not because of speed or tricks, but because of feeling. That kind of connection can't be taught." The boy's face turned red. He wanted to disappear. Praise still felt heavy to him, like a coat too big for his shoulders. But the professional continued. "Talent like this also needs care, guidance, support." They turned to the boy. "Would you like to learn more? Not to change who you are, but to understand what you already have." The boy looked down at his hands. He thought about the piano being taken away. About music turning into pressure? His chest tightened. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly. The professional smiled softly. "Then you mess up. And you keep going." That answer felt safe. From that point on, small lessons became part of his routine. Not strict schedules. Not heavy rules. Just moments of learning. The professionals taught him how to name the sounds he already knew. How to read simple music without losing his natural style. How to protect his hands and body so he wouldn't hurt himself. The boy absorbed it all like a sponge. Something else changed, too. He started to believe, just a little, that his music mattered. Not in a big, famous way, but in a human way. When someone thanked him, he no longer froze. He still felt shy, but he listened. He understood that his playing could sit with someone in their sadness or lift them for a moment. One evening, after a long day, the professional stayed behind with him. The building was quiet. Chairs were stacked. The lights were dim. "You know," the professional said, "I still learn from listening to you."
Oh.
The boy looked surprised. From me? Yes, they replied. You remind me why I started. That was the first time the boy truly saw the professional not as an expert but as a person. Someone who had once been young too. Someone who had once played for love, not for applause. That night the boy went home and lay awake in bed longer than usual. He thought about the piano. About the sounds he hadn't discovered yet. About the idea that maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to take up space in the world. At school, nothing dramatic changed. He was still quiet, still overlooked by many, but inside he stood a little straighter. When kids laughed too loudly, it didn't cut as deep. When teachers spoke over him, he didn't shrink as much. He had something no one could take away. Music had given him a center. One weekend, the professional invited him to play in a slightly bigger room. Not a stage. Just a hall with better sound. The boy's heart raced when he saw it. The ceiling was higher. The piano was newer. The space felt serious. You don't have to play if you don't want to, the professional said. The boy swallowed and nodded. I want to try. He sat down. The piano felt different. The keys were smoother. The sound was clearer. At first he felt lost. Then he closed his eyes and played the way he always did. The room filled with sound. When he finished, the silence was deep. Then someone quietly said, "Thank you." That single word meant more than applause. After that day, the professional had no doubt. They spoke openly with others in the music world. Not with exaggeration, not with promises. Just honesty. There is a child, they said, who plays like he listens to the world. People became curious. But the professional protected the boy. No pressure. No labels. No rushing. You have time, they told him. There's no race. The boy trusted them. One afternoon, as he played alone again in the old room, he thought about how far things had come. Not in distance, but in feeling. The piano was still the same. The bench still a little uncomfortable. The room still quiet, but he was different. He played a new melody, slow and gentle. It carried gratitude, fear, hope, and wonder all at once. When the last note faded, he sat there, breathing softly. He didn't know where this path would lead. He didn't need to, for now. It was enough to know that someone believed in him, and for the first time in his life, he was beginning to believe in himself too. The changes that followed did not happen all at once. There was no sudden spotlight, no loud announcements, no overnight transformation. Instead, life unfolded gently, like the music the boy loved to play. Step by step, his world widened. And he learned how to walk through it without losing himself. He continued visiting the community building, still choosing the old piano whenever it was free. Even when better instruments became available, he often returned to that familiar one. It reminded him of where everything began, of the days when he played only for himself, without expectations. The professionals understood this and never forced him to move on too quickly. They knew that comfort and trust mattered more than perfection. Over time, the boy began playing in front of slightly larger groups. Sometimes it was just a few chairs filled with people sitting quietly. Other times, it was a small gathering arranged by the community. Nothing fancy. No pressure. Just people listening. Each time the boy felt nervous. His heart beat fast before he touched the keys. His hands felt cold. But once he started playing, the fear slowly faded. The music grounded him. It reminded him why he was there. After one such small gathering, an elderly woman approached him slowly. She didn't clap loudly or speak dramatically. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Your music made me feel young again." The boy smiled shyly. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he felt warmth in her words. Moments like that stayed with him longer than applause ever could. At home, his family noticed changes too. He was still quiet, but there was a calm confidence in him now. He talked a little more at dinner. He listened more closely when others spoke. When he practiced rhythms on the table, no one told him to stop anymore. They had begun to understand that this wasn't just play. It was part of who he was. One evening, his mother sat beside him and asked, "Do you really love the piano?" He nodded without hesitation. She smiled and said, "Then we'll figure it out together." That simple support meant everything. As months passed, the professional arranged something important, but they did it carefully. They invited the boy to play at a small local event where musicians of different ages would perform. Nothing competitive, no judges. Just music shared among people who cared about it. When the boy heard about it, fear crept in. He worried about making mistakes, about being compared, about standing out too much. What if I don't belong there? He asked. The professional knelt beside him and said, "You belong anywhere you are honest." That sentence stayed in his mind. On the day of the event, the room buzzed with quiet excitement. Instruments were tuned. People whispered. The boy waited backstage, sitting on a chair that felt too big. He watched others perform. Some played fast, impressive pieces. Others sang with confidence. Everyone seemed so sure of themselves. Then it was his turn. He walked slowly to the piano and sat down. The lights felt bright, but not blinding. The room was quiet. He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't play the hardest piece he knew. He played the one that felt most true. The melody was simple, but full. It moved gently, like a conversation. As he played, the room grew still. People leaned forward without realizing it. Some closed their eyes. Others forgot to breathe for a moment. When the final note faded, there was a pause. Then applause rose, warm and sincere. Not loud, not wild, but deep. The boy stood and bowed quickly, his face red. But inside, something had settled. He had faced his fear and stayed himself. After that day, doors opened, slowly but surely. Opportunities came, but the professional guided him carefully. They said no when things felt rushed. They said yes when it felt right. They protected his childhood as much as his talent. The boy continued learning. He studied music more deeply now, understanding the language behind the sounds he loved. But he never let go of listening first. If something didn't feel right, he asked questions. He trusted his instincts. One day, the professional said something that surprised him. "Someday you might teach others." The boy laughed softly. "Me, yes," they replied. "Because you don't just play, you feel." And that's what people need to remember. The idea stayed with him. Years would pass, and the boy would grow taller. His hands would stretch across the keys more easily. His life would fill with choices, challenges, and responsibilities. But that quiet core inside him would remain the same. Even now, when he sits alone at a piano, he sometimes thinks back to the first key he pressed in that dusty room. He remembers how surprised he felt by the sound, how safe it made him feel, how music gave him a voice when words were too heavy. The professional, too, was changed by the experience. They often spoke about the boy, not as a miracle, but as a reminder. A reminder that music is not about being the best. It is about being honest, about listening, about connection. "This child taught me something," they once said to a colleague. That skill is important, but sincerity is rare. The boy never chased fame. He never asked to be special. He simply followed the sound that made him feel whole. And because of that, people listened. His story became a quiet inspiration, passed from person to person, not as a headline, but as a feeling, a reminder that greatness doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly at an old piano, waiting for someone to notice. And even if the world hadn't noticed, the boy would have kept playing, because music was never about being seen. It was about being heard. And in the end, it was more than enough.